Moderating our panel today is Lars Hallström, who's probably no stranger to many of you. So I'll actually have him come talk a lot. So I'll invite him to the microphone now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, I am your moderator or referee for today. Think of this as like, whether it's WWF or hockey or rugby, whatever you sort of grabs your fancy. Not curling, obviously. I'm very pleased to be here today with two of my fellow political scientists, Shauna Wilton and Clark Bannock, both of whom are professors and teach in the political studies stream here at Augustana. We do have some time constraints. Shauna has informed me that she's out that door no later than 1 o'clock because she has an appointment. She also has some current mobility issues. She has a cane, so if you're between her and the door, I've authorized her to hit people with the cane so that she can get to the door. So we are working under a relatively tight format today. A couple of general observations about that. Clark will be speaking first, followed by myself, followed by Shauna will each speak for about 12 minutes. We do have graphical aids in large format for those of you who are visually challenged like myself, or attention challenged like some of my students. You know who you are. And I would ask that everybody make sure their phones are turned off, or at least silenced at this point, just as a general courtesy. There will be a brief opportunity for questions at the conclusion of the presentations. Questions will come from the microphone at the back, I think we would prefer, just because it's a little weird to get people up onto the stage. And guilty. I hear phones. Sometimes I answer my students' calls. That sort of usually stops the trend. So we will take questions at the end from the microphones, please. So please, if you do have questions, line up and manage yourselves in an orderly fashion. The goal of today's Lunch and Learn is not to incite rage, but rather to incite discussion, deliberation, and broader political engagement and discourse about cellular technologies in today's population, especially in rural Canada. We want people to talk about politics. Of course, we're biased. We want people to talk about policy. We want people to talk about parties. This is not a partisan event. Of course, you can't talk about elections without mentioning parties, but our goal is simply to provide some fodder and some fuel for you to then leave and take back to your communities, to your families, and to your classes as we move into what will doubtless be a very, very interesting election and subsequent change or status quo in our provincial government. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Clark Bannock, and he will be speaking on political parties in Alberta.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you, everybody, for coming. I am going to direct my comments in a very general way, to be honest, about the state of democracy in Alberta, and then I'm going to let Lars and Shauna kind of drill in a little bit deeper into the specific issues. But just to kind of set the stage, I'm just going to stand up here for a second. I'll begin with just a little bit of polling data, and then we'll get into kind of a broader attempt at a broader understanding of what's really been going on in Alberta maybe the last decade or so. My first slide simply depicts the polling data going back now to the summer. What polling companies are telling us the political preferences are of Albertans going back till July. We all know this, or you all know this, no doubt. It's quite clear if you take the polling data to be accurate. It sure seems like the UCP is on its way to a resounding electoral victory. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I do want to just kind of pause and contextualize this polling data by reminding you of kind of the incredible volatility that we've experienced in two previous elections, and then we'll come back to this one. So jog your memory, or jog your mind back to 2012. This was the election that Alison Redford won with the PCs. At that time, the three major players, the Wildrose, the PC, and the NDP weren't really a major player. It was really the Wildrose and PC party. This is polling data up until just 2 or 3 days before the election. It was clear, all the pundits were telling us that the Wildrose was going to win that election and knock the PCs off their perch for the first time in several decades. And then, of course, we all know what happens. right at the very end. You know, in the last 3 days, essentially, of the campaign, Redford and the PCs, you know, pulled it out of the fire, right? Completely unexpected victory. Fast forward to 2015. This chart begins with polling data 3 months before the 2015 election. The blue dot represents the PC party, the orange and green, the Wild Rose. 3 months from election day, the PCs had roughly a 30-point lead, okay, over the opposing parties. It seemed very obvious what was going to happen. We know the obvious did not end up happening, right? Fast forward a month, we start to see you know, things tightening up. The PCs, you know, dropping quite quickly. The other parties increasing, and then, you know, fast forward to the end. You know, the NDP comes out essentially out of nowhere and surprises everybody and wins the election. This, you know, for a political scientist looking at these two outcomes, especially in that very short period up until the electoral campaign, speaks to something we would use the term volatility. There's quite a bit of volatility within the Alberta citizenry, the last couple of elections. When I say volatility, what I mean is essentially you know, large unexpected swings of support, one way or the other, generally over a quite short period of time. It's this volatility that I want to kind of speak of today. I think what this is, the volatility that exists in these previous two elections speaks to kind of a broader volatility that's been occurring in Alberta politics for I would say about a decade, and it has some pretty important ramifications for Alberta going forward. But first, just to, you know, try and take that context and bring it back to the 2019 campaign, there's probably two takeaways, I would say, with respect to this volatility. One, campaigns do matter in Alberta politics, at least they have in the last couple of elections, which, for those of you who have a bit of a longer memory, would understand this, has not always been the case in Alberta politics. Okay, so the fact that campaigns are mattering in Alberta right now is important. And, you know, for any of you who, you know, may be sitting out there, you know, hoping for, you know, an NDP victory, perhaps there's some hope in this story, right? That, you know, within the campaign, things can change. Having said that, I'm not sure I would put any of my money on the NDP in this go around. I do think things are going to tighten up to a degree, but I personally don't see a path forward for the NDP this go around anyway. But that's just one part of the story. A second part that I want to draw from this that I think is a more important, although it's a kind of a longer term story in terms of understanding Alberta politics and what's been going on right now, is that this particular volatility that we see in these last two election campaigns speaks or is part of a much broader period of volatility that goes back at least a decade. And what I would argue it represents is kind of essentially a 10-year rough transition between what political scientists often call party systems. Party systems is a really dorky, you know, political science term that essentially refers to, you know, these patterns of party competition we see in any given period of time. And political scientists look for these kind of patterns in all manners of democracies. Usually what we're looking for is, or looking at is, you know, how many parties are actually competitive at any given time, what kind of parties there are, and, you know, what patterns of support we find. Generally speaking, understanding kind of these aspects of the party system can actually tell us quite a bit of, you know, interesting about, you know, what kind of policy or what kind of governance you can expect as a citizenry. For those of you, again, who, you know a bit of, you know, political history with respect to Alberta, this will come as no surprise to you. Most political scientists agree that going back to at least 1935, we have had in Alberta a dominant single-party system. For 36 long years, the social credit essentially governed uncontested, and then suddenly, you know, they fizzled out and the PCs emerged, and then they governed for even longer, right, for 44 years. Again, largely uncontested, as a dominant single party. That doesn't mean there weren't other parties around, of course there were, and we can, you know, if you really go back into history, you can pinpoint, you know, a small handful of particular elections that were, you know, a bit competitive, but by and large we had uncompetitive election after uncompetitive election after uncompetitive election going for a long period of time. This is very unnatural in democracies. Okay, it would be very rare to find a jurisdiction that is so homogeneous that a single party could encapsulate, the political demands of a vast, segment of the population for so long a period. Okay, now, and to be frank, this kind of thing tends to not produce very good policy. Right, there's very little incentive for parties to innovate. Why was this the case? The simple, stereotypical, and I would argue wrong answer is that Albertans are uniquely conservative, right? That tends to be what we're told. Most of the research, however, suggests that's not, in fact, the case at all. There are all kinds of studies that show, Alberta, at least, in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, has been just as ideologically diverse as any other province in the country. And in fact, most Albertans, even today, are probably centrists, not right or left. So what then explains this dominant single-party system that we've had for so long? There is, in fact, one thing that is unique about Alberta. Most of you are probably guessing this already. It's not that we're really conservative. It's the fact that we have been blessed with an abundance of oil wealth. Okay? We have, for decades, essentially, been given free giant piles of money, year after year after year. Okay? And that really does a lot to insulate a governing party from any kind of competition, especially over the long term. Imagine you're an opposition party trying to campaign against a governing party that, on one hand, can consistently spend wildly, which Alberta parties have done for many, many years. We've been the per capita leader in terms of spending in Canada, while at the same time, maintaining a relatively low tax rate. Okay, how do you beat a government like that? And again, there are different things going on. I'm simplifying to a degree. There are other things that happen structurally when a party gets in place and has these advantages that further kind of ensconce and allow it to ensconce itself in terms of power. Fast forward to contemporary Alberta, 2008, I think is going to go down as a really, really important date in Alberta history going forward. What happens in 2008? And again, I'm simplifying. There's a few other things going on. But 2008, of course, is the Great Recession, right? What happens with the Great Recession? The bottom falls out of the oil industry here in Alberta. There have been ebbs and flows since 2008, but by and large, the oil industry has not really climbed too far away from that hole that it found itself in 2008. That in itself has created a fracture in it's done a few different things. Obviously, it's changed the nature of the economy. It's put a number of people out of work, what have you. But it also created this fracture in our political system, and this begins this slow transition from one party system to another. The first thing that happens, the wild rose breaks away from the PC, and then we go through a couple elections where those two parties are tussling about. The next thing that happens, of course, is the NDP comes out of nowhere, an ideologically opposite party that emerges and is the one that in fact slays the king. Something we hadn't anticipated. What all of this represents, this 10 years of volatility represents, in my estimation, is this transition to a much more natural situation in a democracy, either what we would call a two-party or 2+1 party system, wherein, and what I mean by that is there is a legitimate opposition party that is competitive and could conceivably win any given election. That's something we did not have for a long, long time in Alberta, and that's important to have. It's an obvious point, but it's also an important one to kind of pause on, I think. No matter what you think about a likely UCP government going forward for 4, 8 years, what have you, and don't get me wrong, there will be policy implications with that, and that will be discussed in a second. I do think we are all going to be better off in the long term in a two-party or a 2+1 party system where there is a legitimate opposition party that can authentically hold the governing party to account, and it constrains a governing party. There's very little room for drastic swings one way or the other, little room to grow out of touch, grow entitled, and what have you. So I guess that's the optimistic point I want to make, speaking broadly about Alberta politics, and I'll leave it there, and I think Lars is going to speak more specifically now to the election.
Okay, thank you, Clark. A couple of quick observations. I don't think party systems is anywhere on our continuum of dorky things political scientists say. And for those of you who are wondering, Clark's next book will also be called Unnatural Democracy in Alberta. So I'm going to speak about rural issues and rural policy questions in Alberta. There are lots of these. There will be some that I do not mention. I'm not going to talk too much about oil and gas explicitly. I'm not going to talk about the price of oil. I won't talk about LGBTQ issues. I will not talk about CEUs in education. But there are some things that at a higher level we probably should consider. So, as you can see here, there are a couple of broader contextual strokes that we should draw out. The first has to do with population. It's very difficult in Canada to discuss rural anything without thinking about population, both in terms of decline, i.e. how much is it growing, where is it growing, where is it not growing, and of course some of the significant asymmetries that we have seen not just in Alberta but across the country in terms of where people move to. The second, of course, is the relationship of the economy to rural spaces. Some may argue that rural spaces are disproportionately affected by economic shifts, whether they're agricultural, energy, or even political or policy-based. And there's some long-standing path dependencies or historical trajectories that can help us understand and explain those. At the same time, I always like to refer to, to kind of date myself, in the early 1990s, the Calgary Herald issued a study, a report, about how the Albertan, and particularly the Calgary economy, was now so diverse that it would never be subject to a bust again. Right? Oh, those heady days of the early 1990s. So we have, to put it mildly, put a lot of eggs into a very small number of baskets for a very, very, very long time. And there's some very real repercussions that we're all familiar with to doing so, both political and economic and social. From a rural development standpoint, leaving aside the fact that we did have governmental or provincial business cards with the phrase rural development on them, to be honest, it really did not mean much. There was no significant budget attached to that. Most of the staff resigned or were moved elsewhere, and it really wasn't able to do very much of anything. The emphasis was very much upon agriculture. And my last point then, more generally, is within this context, inequities and differences matter. There are very real differences between rural and urban in terms of money, in terms of development trajectories, in terms of history, in terms of environment, and in terms of broader social systems and concerns. So these are my big six that I would give you. And if you wanted to, you could take these away and put them in front of any candidate in the next few months and say, what do you think about these? I have a hidden curriculum or agenda. There are others, but go ahead, steal from me, it's fine. Plagiarism is okay. So obviously population change is a key factor. Education, rural education is a critical factor. There's a rural education symposium in Edmonton on Monday, in fact, that I will be speaking at. This is a significant area that is a long-standing challenge for both policy officials and for educational decision makers. Rural communities are aging. I'm sorry, but if you look around, would everybody under the age of 30 please raise your hand? Everybody over the age of 50 please raise your hand. Thank you. Related to that, who's been to see a physician in the last 6 months? Please raise your hand. Oh, look, correlation. Okay. Couple of final points. Infrastructure. We cannot talk about rural Alberta and rural Canada without thinking about infrastructural costs. If you, and I do, ask rural municipalities, CAOs, reeves, mayors, what's their biggest single short-term threat to their sustainability? It is not population decline, it's not the closure of schools, it's the fact that their infrastructure is crumbling literally under their feet. Infrastructure is expensive. It is very expensive, and we spend about a third of what we used to spend in the 50s and the 60s on infrastructure as a country. We have a near $1 trillion infrastructural deficit in Canada. That is, of course, very pronounced the further away you get from the larger urban areas. So given these different things, let's remember a little bit of what Clark pointed to, which is that there's, and I'm paraphrasing our colleague or former colleague Roger Epp, there's always been a little bit of a rural compact, or a bit of an agreement between the single governing party and rural communities. And it hinges on how and where they spend money, what they spend money on, and what motivates voting behavior and support. The unfortunate reality is that compact has essentially been breaking for the better part of 30 years, right? Infrastructural spending, municipal spending, community-based spending has been declining across rural Canada, across rural Alberta, and unfortunately we are now, and I say we collectively, are looking at what does that particular bucket of costs add up to. And what does it mean for the next generation, for the students in here, who in 30 years, as I like to tell them, may be in charge of something. So let's go very quickly through some of the dynamics that we have here. This should not be a surprise to anybody. Rural decline in Canada is an ongoing problem. If you look to the left, 1851, this is not new. Second thing that we should consider when we think about population is its relationship to economic change and the reality that the vast majority of movement into Alberta is urban. Alberta is an urban province. I'm sorry, you may not like to hear it, but the numbers are urban. 83% of Albertans are categorized as urban, right? Particularly for those coming from outside of Canada, they move to Calgary and Edmonton for any number of very understandable reasons. But our population growth is one that is fundamentally urban. We're one of the most urban provinces in the country. When we look at the economic considerations of this, it means that our share of productivity is roughly proportional, but it also means that where you live has a very significant impact upon how much money you make. The developmental trajectory for non-metropolitan type places, or what we call census agglomerations or census municipalities, is in the strong to moderate mids, i.e. once you have less than 30% of your population moving to an urban space, your economy suffers significantly. Okay? In turn, the ways that we have been bolstering our economies also speak to some fundamental inequities in terms of rural versus urban spaces. When we look at money, where the revenues are, they're in goods and in services. But when we look in terms of employment, where do people work? It's in sales and in health and in manufacturing. There's an asymmetry there, right? The money is not where the people are. And this is particularly pronounced even in communities like Camrose, right? We see some very real manifestations of those dynamics. Moving on then to education, which is of course near and dear to many of us in this room. Canada, actually not that great. Our high school completion rates are an ongoing struggle within the OECD. Alberta, also not that great. If you are a rural student, in particular, this has implications for the probability of you completing higher education, right? If you are from an urban area, you're twice as likely to complete university as if you are from a rural area, and there are lots of reasons for this, okay? Doesn't hold for tech or college education, it's almost the same. But those upper or differentiated degrees, like you would find here at Augustana or in Edmonton, Calgary, or soon Grand Prairie or Red Deer, are a challenge for rural citizens. There are very real economic implications to this. Not only does it directly affect economic employment opportunities, but also what you earn, but it is, as maybe Shauna will speak to, gender differentiated. Right? If you have not completed high school in a rural area as a woman, you are looking at some very low income revenue trajectories, typically part-time. That's a significant challenge. This is not helped by the fact, of course, that we continue to close schools across the province. When we speak to other demographic factors, young people also leave. It's called learning to leave. We have a long history in North America of sending our best and brightest away to school. We send them to Toronto, we send them to Calgary, we send them to Edmonton. It's not new, but do they come back? And the answer is often no. Because what do they have to come back to or for? Similarly, we have, at the other end of the spectrum, retirement patterns where very small communities are sort of decreasing in population as mid-sized communities such as Camrose actually gain. They become destination retirement hubs. They become the providers of health services, of shopping, of retail, and they have benefited from this. However, I will ask you, given the demographic proportions of baby boomers versus those who are not baby boomers, I myself, what will that look like in 30 years? Who will be left? In conjunction with this, let's come back to that compact and some of the broader cultural perspectives that we might take on Albertan politics. Right? There is absolutely a reluctance to engage with Keynesian type policies and the accumulation of debt in this province as a policy question. I will leave it to you and your friends and colleagues to decide which is the better or preferred option. But given the recent announcements about child poverty rates in this province and some of the responses that I have seen, which is, that's great, but if we're going into debt to do it, we shouldn't bother. And I'm not exaggerating, there are some very real social or human considerations to ask of public policy as we move into election. When we look at municipal infrastructure, municipal funding, it continues to be a challenge. If the tax base is not there, i.e. your population is not there, then you will, as a community, continue to struggle to provide the services to keep people there who will in turn leave, and you are caught in a very vicious cycle of depopulation and abandonment. And as a last point, we then need to think about how do we approach rural development as a strategy, not just in Alberta, but in Canada. Because our tendency has been to focus on rural communities as being part of markets. And that's fine, but markets, if you're competing in a market, you are by definition a competitor. But in these markets, for rural communities, and particularly smaller communities under 5,000 citizens, those markets create losers. And it's a bit like the Circus Maximus. After a while, those losers may not have the privilege of continuing to compete. So with that, I will hand this over to Shauna. On a cheery note. Everybody smiled here on camera.
That's what I was just thinking. We had a little bit of optimism from Clark, and now we get to hear Lars's usual pessimism. And then it comes over to me, and as the woman on the panel, I get to talk about gender. And also because I'm talking about gender, I always, where did my slide go? Oh, there we go. I also get to justify why we should talk about gender. So I'm going to talk about two things. I want to talk about the issue of gender representation within parties and within the legislature, and I'm also going to talk about what we can tell so far about the policy positions of the two main parties, the NDP and the UCP, as they relate to gender. So the main reason I think why we should think about women and women's representation is that democracy is about representing the population, all of the population. This is the simple answer. Women make up half of the population and so deserve a significant proportion of representation. When we get more women into government, especially once we're breaking that 30% threshold, we can see that women too are allowed to represent the diversity of women's perspectives. They're not limited to being sort of the token woman on a committee. They can be conservative women, left-leaning women, poor women, queer women, white, brown, black women, and so on and so forth. So there's this moral issue about democratic justice and our parliaments looking like our population. But there's also a lot of evidence that suggests that women's equal participation in society, in politics, and in the economy is good for society and good for the economy, right? That this benefits us overall. There's more wealth to be distributed, and there are a wider variety of perspectives on all the issues to be discussed. So when we look at the representation of women in Canada on the one side and then in Alberta on the other side, Canada sits 60th of 193 countries in the world for the number of women elected, barely cracking the top 30%, and behind countries such as Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. We can also see here that Canada's at the bottom amongst these other European and Western countries, and one of the key differences that shows up there is that the countries on the top all have proportional representation systems, whereas Canada at the bottom, along with the US and UK, uses a first past the post system, which has been shown to lead to fewer women and fewer minority candidates getting elected. When we look at Alberta, we had a big change in the 2015 election. A record number of women were elected. They accounted for 32% of the seats, which breaks that 30% threshold that the UN, among others, has been aiming for. But the vast majority of these women were NDP. This is the current, not as they were elected in 2015, but the current standings of women. So we could see 3 within the United Conservative Party, which is 12% of their total MLAs, 1 Alberta Party, 1 independent, and the remaining 24 are NDPers, which is about 50% of that party's seats. A nonprofit organization, Parity YEG, has been collecting information on all the nomination races in the province, and also providing campaign information and advice to women. And so they're tracking the number of women who've been nominated. And this might be a bit hard to read, but basically what we see is that with the NDP running for nomination, it's about 50-50. Winning the nominations within the constituencies is about 50-50. And for everyone else, it's about 30% of the people trying to get the nomination are women, and about 30% of the women are succeeding in getting that nomination. What this means in reality is that if the UCP wins the election, which is what it looks like will happen right now, there will be a lot less women in Alberta's legislature. So that raises the question then of why aren't women trying to get the nomination for the United Conservative Party? The UCP is committed to a merit-based nomination process and a nomination process that is free from interference from leadership. These are both great ideas in theory, right? It's hard to argue with the idea that the most deserving person should win the nomination, but the reality is that women are less likely to win nominations and less likely to win elections without extra support just because they're women. There's a variety of reasons behind this. Women tend to be sort of less familiar faces or options. Many constituency and offices aren't encouraging women candidates. And also there's the reality that a lot of women are socialized to not see themselves as viable candidates or as deserving of election without someone encouraging them to do so. We do know that around the world, when political parties make a commitment to running female candidates and follow through on that commitment in concrete ways, more women are elected to government. So according to Dr. Trimble, a colleague of mine at the North Campus, she said it's time for parties to effect some form of internal gender quotas because they have to have targets or else we are not going to see any substantial increases. Women don't just need to be asked, they need to be supported. They need to be told, quote, this is what the party is going to do for you. I know you have no experience, but you'd be great. Let's talk about how to do this. So there's sort of 2 main explanations for why we see less women trying to get the nomination. And one is that if it truly is a merit-based system, then women just aren't as qualified as men for these types of positions, right? The other argument is that there's some kind of structural barriers or social biases that are contributing to this, that are discouraging women from running or discouraging people for voting for women. I do have to, though, refer to Heather Forsyth, the former MLA, who said recently that any arguments suggesting that women are hampered by institutional and cultural barriers are socialist crap. I would have to disagree, but I think that women from both ends of the political spectrum in Alberta are recognizing the need to get more women elected. Rona Ambrose and Maureen Harper have joined together to create an organization called She Leads, which is a nonprofit trying to get more conservative women to run for election. Ambrose said, quote, we just need to reach out and invite strong Alberta women to get into the process, and that's exactly what we're doing, and they're providing support to those women as well. And we've seen this with the NDP, with their Ready for Her campaign for the municipal elections, and also by creating the Status of Women office, which has a mandate of researching and supporting women in leadership positions. Another thing to consider too, though, is the generally very unfriendly climate of politics for women. The chart up there just looks at reported incidents of threats, physical threats to premiers, and we can see they really skyrocket with the election of Notley in 2015. Paula Simon said in an editorial that, quote, "For women, the hate is couched in particularly sexual and sexualized language. They aren't just attacked because people don't like their ideas or policies, they are explicitly attacked for being women with the wrong ideas or policies." And again, Rona Ambrose, the former Conservative MP, also talks about the sexualized and threatening comments that she has received. She said, "I've said to the president of Twitter Canada's face that I think Twitter is a sewer for women, and I've said that they need to make a lot of changes before it is a safe place for women. I had horribly, unbelievably, sexually violent things said towards me, about me, on Facebook and on Twitter. For women politicians, there's this whole other level of sexualized violence." So a lot of women, when they're considering whether or not to enter politics, have to take into consideration whether or not they're willing to expose themselves to that environment. When we look at the two parties and their policies, just to sort of finish up quickly, I do want to leave some time for questions. The NDP has taken a stand on gender issues. It has a record of some achievements. The status of women ministry, for example, we were the only province in Canada that didn't have one prior to this. The Gay-Straight Alliance legislation, which has been a major target of UCP supporters. They've introduced child tax benefits and enhanced family tax credits. They've raised minimum wage, which gets at sort of what Lars was talking about, and has a disproportionate impact on women who tend to work in those part-time, low-wage positions. And they've also tried to address the reality that Alberta has the largest gender pay gap in the country. And this makes sense, right? It makes sense for the NDP to be talking about these issues and to be investing in women, because these are the people that are going to vote for them. We know that in Alberta and in Canada generally, women are less socially conservative and more skeptical of economic liberalism than men are. When we look at the UCP, and this is where I ran into some problems, partially because we're not really into the election yet, and so formal platforms haven't been released. There's not much good I can say about the UCP and gender. And I didn't want to be overly partisan in this, but I looked at their policy declaration from their conference last May. It's 22 pages long. The words gender or woman do not actually appear in the document anywhere. The document is very careful, though. It did take out a lot of the more extreme positions of the party members at the conference. And so instead of talking specifically about the Gay-Straight Alliance, for example, they talk about the rights of parents to have a say in their children's education. Jason Kenney is a smart politician, and he's not going to leave himself open to obvious places where he can be attacked. And so this raises the question, though, is the absence of women from the public face of the UCP and their policy a sign of women's equality? We just don't need to talk about it because it's happening? Or is it more creating an invisibility of gender inequality? And I would expect it's the latter. So I'll just conclude by saying that it's unlikely that the threats to balance the budget, cut public spending, the continued reliance on the oil and gas industry that we've been hearing about from the UCP, it's unlikely that this will be good for women in Alberta. But as we wait for the election call and enter the official campaign period, I think it will be interesting to see how issues of equality for women and for others manifest. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Quick round of applause for our panel. We do have a microphone at the back. Sean is extending it for tall speakers, and we would welcome, encourage, if not openly solicit questions at this time. Madison, you're up. Look, you're sitting next to the mic. Come on.
Sorry, I'm not going to ask a question.